Have you had any headway on this in Congress?
Yes,
Good.
on many aspects of it.
Who's helping you?
Well,
Who are the good guys?
what I would say is places like House Weaponization and House Oversight and House Homeland Security have done very good, honest efforts within their own secular fiefdoms about abuses, abuses from DHS or the National Science Foundation or whatnot. They've done now. Weaponization is a very, very noble committee. It was set up to from what I've heard, is sort of a Church Committee 2.0, abuses by the government. But, that was the Church Committee in 1975, 1976, went after the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and the IRS. Those are the four main. But it was mostly set up because the CIA was busted doing things like infiltrating left-wing student movements to stop the domestic anti-war movement. That's exactly what's happening right now on the other side of the political aisle. It was left-wing populists who the CIA and the Pentagon and the State Department wanted to quell because they were undermining Vietnam War funding. They were changing the minds of representatives who were getting skittish on the Vietnam War. And so in order to avoid losing the political domain of war, we subverted those political populist factions from the left wing who undermined that war effort. And now this is just happening from the other side of the equation. It's not political. You can bet if Donald Trump gave them everything they wanted on foreign policy, how quickly so much of this would dry up. And this is why I think, for example, Ron DeSantis does not get tarred with the same icy Pentagon, dirty diplomat fervor that Donald Trump does, because even though Ron DeSantis goes harder than Trump in many ways on certain domestic left-wing issues, going after wokeness and DEI and all these sort of somewhat partisan issues, his foreign policy vision, as he's articulated, is much more in line with the blob. So it really does come down to that. But this is where I'm getting at with weaponization has its hands somewhat full, I think, with everything it's taking on with the Justice Department, which, by the way, there's this whole Justice Department element to this blob activity, if we have time for, can touch on. But what I'm getting at is, weaponization is taking on, everything from, this ongoing COVID inquiry to abuses by the FBI, to abuses by the Justice Department, to abuses by a dozen different government agencies. And they all have to be educated on the layout, the constellation architecture of the dark heart of it all, which is the foreign policy establishment. So this is really something that we should have had a dedicated committee on 6 years ago. But the issue is I do think that there could be an element of capture here. If you've seen the movie Big Short, you're familiar with that scene where, the person is talking at the pool to someone from Moody's or S&P, the bond rating agencies, and the person's saying, hey, have you looked at these AAA ratings being given by the banks on these mortgage-backed securities? And the person who's tasked with oversight and accountability, I guess at the SEC, of those debt instruments, is saying, we don't really look at those anymore. Actually, I'm floating my resume to these banks. And the person says, shouldn't this be illegal? You're supposed to be oversight and accountability of the banks. So it's sort of, are you rubber stamping these garbage mortgage-backed securities and giving them a perfect AAA rating because your own financial future is hitched to the star of this financial network? I have concerns about that relationship between the people who are supposed to be overseeing the blob and the people who are funded by the blob and who are invited to the blob cocktail parties and who do their Aspen ski retreats with fellow blob compatriots. I understand it is a delicate tango dance because what you're talking about is something that has potential huge diplomatic blowback. So much of U.S. diplomacy hinges on free speech because this is our cudgel to pry other countries open with. This is our open society doctrine. One of the reasons that George Soros and the Open Society Foundation is such an active and an effective co-sponsor of State Department or USAID activity. This notion of open society is what allows our U.S. national interests to penetrate the region and influence the internal politics. And I'm not even saying, There's different schools of thought on that. I'm not weighing in on whether that's good or bad. I want free speech on the internet. And I want Americans to be able to determine our own elections and our own social and cultural and political discourse. And I don't want to be caught in a proxy war any longer between this foreign-facing Department of Dirty Tricks and our domestic speech at home. But what I'm getting at here is, I think what needs to be offered to people who mean well on both sides of the political aisle. I'm not just talking about Republicans, although they happen to be predominantly the ones who have taken this issue up, is you have to be able to articulate a firewall between the capacity to do this in other countries and its blowback on American citizens here and American platforms that are used internationally. Because I don't think you can get the political will to do heavy surgery to this, at least in the beginning, because we have this Moody's, S&P, Goldman Sachs problem, where the people who are tasked with accountability and oversight are all in good standing with these institutions. They don't want to embarrass their friends. They don't want to cause a diplomatic incident that prevents us from, overthrowing a dictator in Belarus or stopping infringements on women's rights in Iran or Afghanistan. I'm not trying to have the elephant trample, the whole wheat field here.
Yeah.
But this specific network has to be stopped. This specific aspect, isn't propaganda enough? What really changed in 2016? Brexit happened. Trump won the election. What else called for such a dramatic change in our diplomatic toolkit to tack on censorship as an entire subfield of democracy promotion? That can be taken out now without too much structural damage to our soft power work. That's not going to dramatically undercut, for the time being, what Special Forces is doing. Dramatically undercut, what Voice of America is doing, or Internews, or any of these other giant spider webs of U.S. propaganda. But it is getting to that point as these censorship institutions develop the tree root of linkages with all the different university centers. We have over 60 U.S. university centers getting $100 million from the U.S. government funding their disinformation studies programs. So already, this tree root is vast. You cut off the National Science Foundation funding, 60 universities are going to have people saying, "Oh my God, what am I going to do about my mortgage? Oh my God, what about my college fund for my kids? I've hitched my career to this." And it's tied into our computer science program and our applied physics program and our communications and our sociology programs. And this is going to make it difficult for judges to want to rule in favor of the First Amendment because they're going to be peripherally aware of the collateral damage they're doing economically. I saw this, again, when I was at State, and I remember seeing a stakeholder memo arguing, at the time, Trump was not even really peripherally aware of all this censorship industry ecosystem, but he was aware of censorship generally, and he was trying to pass through reforms to Section 230. If you remember this is this liability safe harbor for tech platforms, where if you are a neutral platform instead of a publisher like the New York Times, you're not subject to defamation or libel lawsuits, so that you're not responsible for what every person does. Mm-hmm. Basically the thing that Pavel Durov, the Telegram founder, got arrested for. They said he's liable for everything on the platform. This Section 230 protection has protected Facebook and YouTube. It's what allows us to have social media. And Trump was trying to get changes done through that. He would do these all caps tweets, repeal Section 230. And I remember seeing a stakeholder memo arguing that there were about 100,000 jobs in content moderation at that time in 2020 in the content moderation space. And the economic impact of repealing Section 230 or doing dramatic changes to the content moderation industry ecosystem would be like shutting down a coal mine in West Virginia. Even if you're trying to switch to green energy, look what you're going to do to Appalachia. That's the argument they were making in 2020, 4 years ago, about the censorship industry. So it's a lot worse now. And so but you have to sunset these programs. Fine. You want to pass something that say, all right, it's already so vast, we already have so many in-process regulation. Okay, you got 18 months. Find a new career in 18 months. We're phasing it out. There's any number of solutions that can be pitched, but this education process has to start, and I'm grateful to being able to talk to you and your audience to help advance that, because this is going to take a long time for those interests to all be represented within the Republican Party, within the elements of the Democrat Party that are amenable to this. I think Robert F. Kennedy and the Democrat faction he represents is very much on board with this. But they all are going to have, one faction is going to say, well, listen, my donors are primarily coming from military contractors, and, we love our military. We do. We don't want the military to be handcuffed because the counter disinformation work it does there is essential to shaping the information environment. Okay, so there might be some concessions you need to make there around the sunset period or the funding or the firewalls. The State Department, the IC, the private sector companies are all going to have their own stakeholder input. But these talks, the strategic imperative has to be airtight agreed to. And the process that may take months or, a year and a half or something for it to finally, get ironed out, because it's everywhere now. The roots are in all these government agencies, all these civil society institutions. So it's a huge task that we have before us. But if I can offer a sort of white pill, a sort of good news on this is, I remember so vividly in early 2017 when this tone that I have now is the tone that they had when they set this up. When you had these USAID administrators and these National Endowment for Democracy folks and these major NATO military contractors and these US ambassadors and all their private sector and financial stakeholders all in room saying, how are we gonna put this censorship apparatus in place? What we're up against is so big. These tech companies are so powerful. They're practically their own private empire. Mm-hmm. They have this culture of free speech. They have this culture of libertarianism. We're helpless. And you would have the US, these US ambassadors talking to people in Greece and in Spain and in Germany, and these German regulators and these Greek regulators are saying, oh, Google's bigger than us. We can't stop them. The US ambassadors are reassuring them to say, listen, it's going to be a long road. It's not going to happen overnight, but we need to begin to take the steps. We're building our consensus. We're doing it multi-stakeholder. It's whole of society. It's, we don't need to, win the war in a day, but everyone can do their part, pull their lever, secure the buy-in, and we can bring these tech companies to heel. They will fold to us with our powers combined. We just need to start the process of combining them, and the rest, will fall into place, or we will call an audible as we go. And I watched that process. They were doing that in 2017, talking about how they might not be able to, and we really need to make this urgent. We need to pour all our effort into it. And it did take years. It did take 3 years for them to put in place between 2017 and 2020 the apparatus they would use for the 2020 election. And it didn't all happen at once. A little bit of it in 2017, a lot of it in 2018. The 2019 stuff was built on that architecture from 2018. It's the same process for dismembering it. We need to do the same thing they did to put it in drive, to put it in reverse. And it can be done, but it will be slow and painful.